Welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled to have you here today. We're going to unpack what is arguably one of the most chilling, downright baffling mysteries of the entire 20th century, the 1959 Dyatlov Pass Incident. Imagine a group of seasoned, hardcore adventurers vanishing into the frozen wilderness of the Soviet Union, only to leave behind a crime scene, or rather, a puzzle that has stumped investigators for over 6 decades.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this is the eerie paradox that sits right at the heart of our explainer today. What could possibly compel 9 rational, highly trained survivalists to slice their way out of their only safe shelter and run headfirst into a deadly -40°C blizzard? And to do it wearing only their socks, or completely barefoot. It's a scenario that literally defies every basic survival instinct we have. Today, we're going to break down exactly what the evidence tells us. Part 1. The Doomed Expedition, the 1959 journey to Kholat Syakhl. Before we get into the mystery, we really need to understand the people involved. Led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, this team was tackling a Category 3 hike. At the time, that was the absolute highest difficulty level you could attempt in the Soviet Union. And what's really fascinating here is just how completely routine their first week was. Everything went perfectly to plan. They get the route book on January 23rd, train ride to Ivdel on the 25th. They start the actual trek on the 27th. By February 1st, they're pitching their final camp on the eastern slope of a mountain called Kholat Syakhl. It was totally textbook.
When you review the makeup of the crew, it really highlights the tragic reality of who was actually on that mountain. These were young, vibrant university students in their early 20s, hiking alongside one older war-hardened member, Semyon Zolotaryov, who was 38. Every single one of them was a seasoned Grade 2 hiker working on their Grade 3 certification. They were tough, they were tested, and they absolutely knew the snow. But as you can see by the glaring differences in their causes of death, all that expertise couldn't save them from whatever happened on that slope.
Moving on to Part 2, a bizarre discovery. February 26th, the search party arrives.
So the expected return date comes and goes, and nobody shows up. Rescue operations get launched, first by student volunteers, then teachers, and eventually the actual military steps in. Weeks later, a search party finally stumbles onto that final camp, and what they find is just beyond baffling. The tent is half torn down, buried in the snow. All their cold weather gear, their supplies, and crucially their shoes are still inside. But here's the detail that gives you chills. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Think about the sheer, sudden terror it takes for experienced mountaineers to decide that unbuttoning the flap is just too slow, and they literally have to slash their way out of their own shelter.
1.5 kilometers. That's almost a full mile. That is the distance that 9 sets of footprints led away from that ruined tent, heading down the slope toward a dark tree line. And remember, these weren't heavy boot tracks. These prints were left by people wearing only socks, maybe a single shoe, or walking completely barefoot through deep snow in -40° temperatures. The way the searchers uncovered the victims played out in a really grim, terrifying sequence. First, down at the edge of the woods under a massive Siberian pine, they find the ashes of a tiny fire in 2 shoeless bodies dressed only in their underwear. Wildly, the branches on that pine tree were snapped off up to 5 meters high, like someone was desperately trying to climb it or scrounge for wood. Next, on the open slope between that tree and the tent, they find 3 more bodies, including Dyatlov himself, frozen in poses that basically showed them crawling, desperately trying to get back to camp. Finally, it took over 2 months as the spring thaw set in to find the last 4 hikers. They were buried under 4 meters, that's over 13 feet of snow in a deep ravine.
This takes us to Part 3, Unexplained and Fatal Injuries, the Autopsy Anomalies.
If the scene at the camp was weird, the medical inquest is what truly skyrocketed this from a tragic hiking accident into a global obsession. The facts here are just staggering. There's a massive contrast between the 2 groups of victims. The first 5 bodies, the ones by the tree and on the slope, died of standard hypothermia. Makes sense, right? But the 4 bodies pulled from the ravine completely flipped the script. 3 of those hikers had catastrophic, fatal injuries. We're talking crushed skulls and caved-in chests. The forensic expert at the time went on record saying the immense pressure required to cause those specific bone fractures was equivalent to a high-speed car crash. But here's the kicker. They had almost 0 external cuts or scrapes. It was like they'd been crushed by an invisible, uniformed weight. And then there was the soft tissue damage. This is the stuff that fueled decades of sensational newspaper headlines. The bodies found deep in the stream were missing their eyes, a tongue, and their eyebrows.
Now, let's be real for a second. The forensic experts were very clear that these specific grotesque injuries happened post-mortem. It's just the unfortunate natural ecological result of bodies resting in a running stream of meltwater for months. But you can absolutely imagine how those specific details sent the public's imagination totally off the rails.
Before we dive into the wild theories, let's actually ground one of the weirdest details in proven science. Why were some of them in their underwear? Medical science points to a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. It's a very real, documented behavior that happens in the absolute final, critical stages of severe hypothermia. Your brain basically misfires, your blood vessels dilate, and you suddenly feel this overwhelming sensation of burning up. It causes freezing people to frantically strip off their clothes, right in the middle of sub-zero temperatures.
Section 4. Decades of Wild Theories. A Compelling Natural Force.
So, the initial 1959 investigation officially closes with this super vague, highly unsatisfying conclusion. They essentially said a compelling natural force killed the hikers, and then they locked the files away. Well, when you combine a vacuum of official information with incredibly bizarre evidence, you get a tidal wave of theories. Let's look at what the public has cooked up over the decades. Some thought it was an attack by the local indigenous Mansi people, though police quickly ruled that out since there was zero extra footprints and the Mansi were known to be very peaceful. Others thought maybe a bear or wolf attack. Fast forward a bit and modern authors start pitching infrasound, the idea that wind howling over the mountain's dome created low-frequency sound waves that literally induced uncontrollable panic attacks. Then you get the big ones, secret Soviet military tests, like parachute mines or radiological weapons. And of course, the inevitable theories involving UFOs and ball lightning. To be clear, we're just laying these out as the fascinating ideas that captivated everyone's minds.
But why on earth did those UFO and military cover-up theories stick around for so long? Well, it wasn't just pure fiction. Reporters later dug up the fact that trace levels of radiation were actually found on a couple pieces of the victim's clothing. On top of that, another completely separate group of hikers about 50 kilometers away, and even the local meteorology teams, reported seeing these strange glowing orange spheres floating in the northern sky on the exact night of the incident. Combine glowing orbs, radioactive pants, and a Soviet government cover-up, and honestly, it's no wonder the conspiracy theories went absolutely mainstream. Which brings us to Part 5. Modern Science Weighs In, reopening the case from 2019 to 2021.
Fast forward to 2019, the Russian government actually reopens the investigation to apply modern terrain physics, and meanwhile, Swiss scientists decide to run independent, high-tech computer simulations to solve the mountain's mechanical riddle. The Swiss model from 2021 gave us a massive breakthrough. They proved the total viability of a slab avalanche. See, when the hikers dug into the snow to create a flat pad for their tent, they accidentally compromised the structural base of the snowpack. In the middle of the night, a dense, cohesive block of snow slid down. This isn't a Hollywood avalanche with a roaring cloud of powder. It's a heavy, solid slab that would make a terrifyingly loud crack before dropping directly onto the tent. This perfectly scientifically explains that uniform, crushing pressure that caused those car crash-like chest and skull fractures without tearing the skin.
A joint Swedish-Russian expedition back in 2019 offered up another fascinating piece of the puzzle: a katabatic wind. If you haven't heard of it, a katabatic wind is a rare, violently sudden, hurricane-force draft that basically plunges straight down a mountain slope under the force of gravity. Researchers realized that the weather conditions that specific night were brutal, with winds whipping up to 30 meters per second. A sudden, deafening blast of wind like that hitting the crippled tent would make staying on that exposed slope an absolute death sentence, forcing them into an immediate, no-hesitation evacuation down to the tree line.
When you put all this modern data together, it builds a totally new, completely heartbreaking understanding of their final hours. Far from a panic-induced irrational frenzy, investigators now firmly believe that the skiers' advanced expertise is exactly what doomed them. Believing they were caught in an active avalanche zone, they executed a completely textbook emergency evacuation. They retreated to the tree line. They started a signal fire. They even managed to dig a snow cave in a ravine for shelter. Think about that. If they had been inexperienced amateurs, they might have just stayed near the crushed tent and tried to dig out their boots. Instead, they did everything right by the book for an avalanche, but taking that very action meant exposing themselves to a deadly -40-degree storm that ultimately took their lives.
In 2020, Andrei Kuryakov, who was the deputy head of the regional prosecutor's office, summarized the final findings with this incredibly profound thought. He said, "It was a heroic struggle. There was no panic, but they had no chance to save themselves under the circumstances." I think that fundamentally changes how we have to view the Dyatlov group. They weren't driven to madness by aliens or government weapons. They were fighting rationally, bravely, and desperately for their survival against completely insurmountable natural odds.
Modern science has definitely illuminated the heavy mechanics of the tragedy. It explains the crushing physical injuries, the paradoxical undressing, and the brutal reality of the cold. And yet, the exact split-second catalyst remains frozen in time. Was it the terrifying, bone-rattling crack of a snow slab dropping, or the deafening, sudden roar of a katabatic wind, or maybe something else entirely? So I leave you with this. When you look at the evidence we laid out today, which compelling natural force do you think forced them to make that very first fatal cut in the dark? Thank you so much for exploring this incredible mystery with me today on The Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.
Oh, hello there. I'm Gemini.